How can we identify the layers of growth, personally, socially, and globally? What are the signs missed, the truths being denied? Science, history, politics, psychology, ancient civilizations, alien contact, the new psychedelic revolution, cryptocurrency, and other disruptive and distributed technologies.
A facet or an aspect of all layers of human consciousness, but particularly important as we begin this big transition into second tier. So we'll have a good chat about that. And we might start up just having a look at a current affair.
Absolutely. Of course, the coronavirus is the number one story in the world at the moment, and very hard to know exactly what's going on. We're just going to tease out a little bit of what we've seen regarding that, the situation worldwide with the coronavirus. So what do we know, Steve? What are we looking at?
Well, it's pretty much impossible to make too many definite conclusions about the origin of this virus, but there are some really unusual things going on around it, and they're not really, the whole picture's not being put together by any media outlet that I've seen so far. So I thought it might be worth just going through the timeline for the emergence of the virus and some of the related incidents that have been happening. As those things don't seem to add up to me. There seems to be something unusual about this, which could mean that there's stuff going on that's not being reported in the media at all. And I think first and foremost, we've got to look at it in the context of the growing East versus West tension and all of the stuff that's been happening, particularly between the US and China.
Yeah, the trade wars.
Trade wars and the balance of power shifting globally, and the US is obviously very concerned about that. The tension in the South China Sea, about China's presence on those islands there, which goes back decades and decades. I can remember reading magazines back in the 80s that were predicting future tension around that issue in the South China Sea.
And of course, there's Taiwan and Hong Kong. It's a lot of issues running at the moment, that's right.
A whole bunch of things. Hong Kong, of course, has been the site of considerable civil unrest in protest against the Chinese controlled government there. And interestingly, Wuhan, which has been named as an important centre in relation to the coronavirus, was also the site of a very, very large protest in, I think, July last year, which was over the plan to build a garbage incinerator in the city, which the local people didn't want, and they were worried about it polluting the air and all that kind of stuff. And it was reported that 10,000 people took to the streets in Wuhan last year, which is very unusual for mainstream.
In China.
Yeah, and also in the context of what's going on in Hong Kong, you can understand that the Chinese government would have been very, very concerned about that size of a protest on mainland China. So there's that, and in the background you've got all the other stuff going on, like cyber warfare, between the East and West. And a lot of which, goes under the radar and doesn't get reported very much. And also accusations of Chinese interference in domestic politics in many countries around the world, including here in Australia.
Yep.
And the South Pacific and I think some countries in Africa as well. So there's a whole lot going on in the background here, and you've got to really take all of that into account when you start to think about the actions that have been taken in relation to the emergence of the coronavirus, which to me are looking like an overreaction at this point. Yeah.
And of course there's fallout here in Australia reporting that the closing down of borders, the inability of Chinese and others to move out of the affected areas is clamping down all over the world. And in Australia, of course, that affects very much our economy because we have so much Chinese trade, so many Chinese visitors, tourism, and many, many, many Chinese students, especially right now at the beginning of the university year at the moment. So that's going to affect Australia's economy and other countries too. So it's interesting with as you said, the trade wars, and yet as a supposed ally of the States, we're going to be at effect financially to some degree of this situation.
It's looking that way, but it's very like Australia just to copy whatever the US does when it comes to this kind of thing. That's what we usually do, just fall in line and do the same thing.
Guys. Thank you. Well, back in my era, of course, it was all the way with LBJ for Vietnam. That was a slogan at the time in the mid-60s.
Yeah, and of course there was a US politician who came out recently and made a public statement about how advantageous it would be to US trade that China was closing its borders and there was a restriction on travel.
That was one of the strange things for me, was hearing that from Wilbur Ross, the Commerce Secretary. It just seemed completely out of line that he would be insinuating that this is going to be a good thing and we can build our economy out of this and jobs will be coming back to America because of that. And it struck me as odd.
It is. I think it is odd. I mean, it's not unusual for people to come out and say stupid things in public these days. It happens a hell of a lot. But you've got to just take all of these little things into account, and there's quite a few other little breadcrumbs in the trail there, which we might have a look at in a minute.
I mean, when you're talking about that sort of comment where you take a tragedy that's emerging, no matter how you see it, how it's been configured and what the result will really be, and turn it immediately into a financial equation for yourself or for your country. I mean, this is, in terms of Claire W. Graves' work, this is quite a strong example of the layer that we're sort of emerging out of, is that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. That sort of orange scientific industrial layer where success comes at any cost almost, and we've got to the point where business has become a profit-making venture, and people who have influence are not concerned about people dying, so they can make money. Yeah.
And what about some of the reporting that this virus has been added to, spliced? I think it's called a spiked protein has been added to. What's that all about? What do we know about that?
I reached out to a contact of mine who used to be the CEO of a vaccine development company, and they used to focus particularly on viruses that jump species. So the same kind of thing that we're dealing with here. And he pointed me to a paper that was recently published by some Indian scientists who looked at this, and I can't explain the technical details of it, but there were some patterns in the coronavirus itself which seemed to have possibly been cut and pasted out of the HIV virus, basically.
Yep.
And the Indians in the paper were basically concluding that, okay, this is genetically engineered. But my advisor said that it's not a unique case. There are some other proteins which also have this particular pattern in them that it also equates to the HIV virus patterns. But so again, there's not enough evidence there to make an absolute conclusion, but it's a possibility. We've got to hold that possibility open that this has been genetically engineered. And of course, Wuhan is the location of China's only declared laboratory for studying deadly diseases.
It's known as P4 facilities, which are fairly rare around the world. I'm not sure if we have one in Australia, but there's one in Canada, which is somewhat implicated here too. That's another part of another thread of the story, which we don't really know if it's true, but it's there.
Yeah, and there was the case of a Chinese-born scientist who was working at a similar kind of lab, level 4 lab in Canada.
Winnipeg.
And had been making trips between Canada and China, including visiting and working at that Wuhan lab for the, I think, 2017, 2018.
Yep.
And is now the subject of an investigation. So again, that's another strange piece of the puzzle. So we've got the possibility, again, we can't be certain that it has been genetically engineered, some strange link between Canada, or at least some strange travel between Canada and that particular lab in Wuhan. And
possibly the escape of the virus. I mean, I guess it's one possibility, but how realistic is that, given these kind of facilities?
I think, these facilities are usually very, very strictly controlled, and I know from my own limited experience in the military dealing with biological and nuclear issues. I had some
training in this.
I had some very basic training, which was defensive training. So I did a course in how to teach people to protect themselves against these sorts of threats by dressing up in protective suits, using masks, going through decontamination processes and those sorts of things. And the environments that use these kinds of things are very, very strictly controlled usually. But again, there's always the possibility of a mistake being made, or some corruption or subversion, by a foreign power, perhaps. So, there's straight away there's a whole bunch of interesting sort of background issues. There's the general tension between East versus West. There's the link between unrest in Hong Kong and all of a sudden a whole bunch of unrest in Wuhan, and no doubt the Chinese government wanting to try and quash both of those. I think there's a strong possibility, again, no proof, but a strong possibility that there's been foreign support to the protesters in Hong Kong to try and stir things up for China. I mean, if I was operating from layer 5 and I wanted to increase my chances of succeeding in the trade war, I'd probably throw a match on something that might burn in a place like that. And then all of a sudden there's an issue in Wuhan, and again the possibility that somebody could see that as an opportunity to exploit, creating further problems for China by somehow stirring up more trouble in Wuhan. Wuhan's got a infectious diseases lab. Wouldn't it be awful if something got out of there, and caused further trouble for China? I mean, it's just a fictional assumption at this stage, but it's certainly a possibility.
One of the other things, of course, is fear. And as you're talking, I'm thinking about 9/11 and the weeks after. I was living in New York, as you guys know, at that time, so you, and the anthrax scare that had happened a few weeks after 9/11, and that flooded through the US, particularly in New York, in my experience, and the fear that was generated from that was incredible. And I remember my dear wife at the time, Rachel, refusing to go down to the letterbox. And
I think there were a lot of people.
Yeah, I'm sure lots of people
didn't want to even open the mail.
Didn't want to open the mail, and that level of fear created a template for something, for what, and it seems like there's an element going on here for sure.
Yeah, and the particular value set that we're talking about, the scientific industrial era value set, is really good at exploiting opportunities. And particularly if there's some sort of financial gain and personal success attached. So even if this was a genuine natural event where, something jumped out of a fish and onto a person at the fish market, which was, the general story going around, and then spread, and it was just a natural event, then it could still be seen as an opportunity for somebody to exploit. So, any opportunity to try and make it look worse, for example, declaring a global health emergency.
Yes, which the WHO has
locking
done.
down borders.
Yeah, those sorts of things, they're all very likely scenarios. If we compare the coronavirus outbreak to the SARS outbreak in 2003, and most of us would remember all the publicity that went around with that, and the scanners that they had at airports looking at people's temperature as they came through and all those sorts of things. The death rate from the SARS virus back then was roughly 9.6% of those who were confirmed with the virus died, whereas the coronavirus death rate is just over 2%, so it's much, much lower. And yet the New York Times has reported that the initial Chinese response was the largest known quarantine effort in human history. And you've got to ask yourself, why were the Chinese so worried about that? If it had come out of their lab and if they had all the data on the virus, they probably would have known that it wasn't that serious in terms of the potential death toll. Yet they've pulled what the New York Times is calling the largest quarantine effort in human history, where they completely shut down a transport hub, this transport hub was larger than New York City, according to the New York Times. So what's going on there? Could it be that China suspected that it was foreign interference and therefore overreacted just in case? That's another possibility.
It's also true that the fish market you just referred to is only about 20 or 30 miles, 40, 50 kilometres from the P4 facility in Wuhan. So there's something there. There's some link there.
Yeah, absolutely. And Radio Free Asia, which is a private radio station established by the US Congress and funded by the government of the United States, in the last week in January, they rebroadcast a local Wuhan television report from 2015 showing China's most advanced virus research laboratory, known as the Wuhan Institute of Virology. So that was really good of them to screen that show.
Free, what's happening? What was that? The title?
Radio Free Asia.
Radio Free Asia,
which is run by the US
funded by the US government.
Just decided to rescreen that from 2015 just to help spread the joy, I guess. Yes. So that happened, and then you've got the Canadian link, and the Washington Post, which of course is a well-known newspaper in the United States.
Mouthpiece for what? Well, what would you say? How would you describe the Washington Post, Mitch?
Bezos. it's Jeff Bezos.
From Amazon. Richest man in the world.
His magic. Yep.
So they published an article which I'm just going to pull up when I can find it here, and quoted an Israeli biological warfare expert in their article saying that this is really is a global threat, and basically pumping up the fear around the issue. So it seems that there's been some effort on the part of the US to try and increase the concern about this. And then, of course, you've got the World Health Organization, part of the United Nations, which declared a global health emergency, which everybody probably knows the United Nations is based in the US. So there's definitely, even if there was absolutely no foreign interference in the emergence of the virus and it wasn't genetically engineered, there's definitely been some effort to pump up the fear volume on this for sure.
And the other aspect which has been talked about, because I think after the SARS virus, I think it was 4 months after that vaccine for the SARS virus came out, I think that's, I remember that report somewhere recently, and the question that some people are asking as well, do they have the vaccine ready for this? Is the fear generated? I don't want to be too conspiratorial here, but that's an element here where if fear is generated enough and suddenly the vaccine is there, pharmaceutical companies can make zillions from this and people can go and get themselves vaccinated from this new virus.
Yeah,
what do you think about that?
We'll see. I mean, if there's any basis to that, we'll see that happen, and I haven't seen it happening yet. One good news piece out of this is that as far as I'm aware, and this again is relying on the media reports to be accurate, an Australian laboratory was the first to replicate the coronavirus and therefore make progress towards developing a vaccine. So that's kind of good news that we've got that expertise which can work very, very quickly to do that kind of thing. And my advisor that I was talking about before, who's worked in the industry, did tell me that Australia is one of the best off countries in the world when it comes to having those sorts of technologies, and the Commonwealth Serum Laboratories that we have here, which are capable of producing vaccines, and many countries don't have that kind of in-house expertise, so we are fortunate here.
Yes, we have a great history actually of R&D in the medical industry, still probably not supported as much as it could be by recent government times, but we have a very magnificent record in that area, actually.
So it'll be interesting to watch this. I mean, this is purely fictional assumptions on my part, but if I was working for some foreign intelligence agency and I wanted to mess with China, and I saw the opportunity of protest in a town or city like Wuhan, where we could possibly stoke the fires there, and then I noticed that Wuhan had a lab that worked with viruses, then it would be probably a smart idea to try and release something there, and then it could easily be blamed on a local mistake. If I was doing that, I'd probably produce something that didn't rate as a biological weapon, so it wouldn't look like a biological weapon. And they've been throwing around this figure in the media of 33%.
Yes, well, I brought that up, and you said that's an old frame.
Yeah, that's based on old-fashioned conventional warfare, where it would be used en masse against a foreign, military.
Like something like anthrax, for example.
Yeah, and these days warfare is not like that anymore. It's much more targeted, much more discreet in many cases. So it's a possible scenario, but just to reiterate, there really is no evidence either way of how this originated yet. We're going to have to wait and see, and I think there's pretty clear evidence though that the fear factor's been pumped up by foreign bodies and foreign governments.
And of course it sells press, it sells media, it sells advertising.
It does, and it helps the trade war.